Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, my guest today is the philosopher and author Nina Power. I'm very pleased that she's joining us. She has just written her latest book, What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents. Timely, I think you'll agree. Nina, why did you write this book?
Well, I think increasingly it was partly to do with this kind of feeling I was getting that men were being kind of demonized increasingly in like left-wing and liberal press. And I'd already written quite a bit about feminism, and I think a lot of what describes itself as feminism today isn't actually feminism, but rather a kind of sort of superficial ideological cover story for other things that are going on. So I actually wanted to write something that was reasonable and balanced. I wanted to look at some of the supposed complaints of so-called men's rights activists and see if there was what was going on with them, rather than just do this kind of dismissive demonization, which I think we see a lot, particularly in the last 5 years.
Yep. What I found interesting is you wrote what men really want. Could a man write a book with that title, do you think?
Well, I mean, the title is obviously a joke, a reference to Freud in
Yes.
two ways. So obviously, famously or infamously, Freud says, "What does woman want?" and he doesn't know the answer.
Yeah.
So I thought I would make a joke about that. And of course, sometimes some people have responded in an upset way to the title. Is it, "How dare you," you know?
Well, you mean, how dare you presume to know?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
And of course
yeah.
I say that I don't answer the question. I mean, I have a list in the book
Yeah.
where I've asked my male friends and they've given me like a 1 or 2 word answer, like a beer or a shed or to be left alone and these kind of things. But of course there is no one answer to this question. But I wanted to pitch it in that way because I wanted to talk about desire and this more kind of psychoanalytic level to some extent, like to get beneath the kind of culture war stuff. Either the sort of demonization of men or of the kind of, I don't know, maybe sometimes overly simplistic idea that men are one thing.
And that one thing would be what?
Yeah, I suppose, well, to be honest, the more I wrote the book, the more I found that I had sympathy with a certain kind of masculinist discourse, actually, which is about what it means to recover manhood or masculinity in an era which seems like it wants to destroy it, you know, and that would go in relation to being a good man, to being a father, you know, to simply being somebody who looks after themselves and looks after other people and sort of takes responsibility. So actually it became more of a book about those bigger questions about almost like moral virtue to some extent, and the way in which being a good man seems to be occluded or obscured in our kind of liberal degenerate world. But it also became a book about the relationship between men and women as well. So I talk about this idea of heterosociality, like we're in this very mixed world. You know, all of these kind of separate spheres have been eroded, and we're together all the time at school, at work, and you know, in general. And I suppose it's like it's a question about the limits of that mixed liberal project. It's like, you know, and I think a lot of people are asking themselves these questions, you know, have we gone too far in certain ways? And are there ways in which we can preserve difference, sexual difference, for example, where it's important to do so? You know, and we see these kind of tensions, these blurring of the boundaries constantly, and they're causing a kind of great deal of upset. So, I mean, I wanted to write something that was reasonable and balanced, which I think in the current climate is almost provocative because everything seems to have to be polemical.
Yeah.
You know, and I didn't want to do that.
You actually make the point at the beginning, which I think is very important. You said, I'm going to use the word sex throughout the book as opposed to gender. This is one of the big things, isn't it? I mean, basically, biological sex as opposed to gender, which is, you know, where so many of the arguments now stem from.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think gender, it was a mistake in a way to ever use that word. It came from John Money, who is, you know, a kind of disgraced researcher who tried to use it to say that there is a difference between sex and the social reception of sex. And he thought that he could bring up boys as if they were girls and that this wouldn't have any...
When was that actually? I didn't realise that.
When did he do this? I'm not sure of the dates, but there were a couple of boys, one of whom lost his genitals in an accident, and John Money decided to, with the parents' consent, to bring up the boy as if he were a girl. But a lot of his practice was extremely unethical, and both of the boys ended up committing suicide. And John Money is really a very disgraced figure. But so basically, and then, some of the second wave feminists use gender as a way of talking about social expectation and social constructs. The idea that on top of sex, there is expectation that is particularly narrow, so that boys must behave in one way and girls must behave in another. And obviously they wanted to challenge that, and for both boys and girls, and to say, no, social expectation should be kind of abolished or eliminated, and that everybody should be free to express themselves however they want, and that historically this has been particularly detrimental for girls who have been kind of funneled into narrow, roles. Yeah. So there was a kind of strategic use of gender at a particular point in the 70s, and I think that filtered down. As someone who was at school in the 1990s, there was a kind of ambient second wave idea, not explicitly, but the idea that you could be anything. It didn't matter if you were a girl, you could, be interested in things that were historically boy things or whatever. But since then, there's been this kind of, I think, very regressive move towards thinking of gender as something that is a feeling. That's something like almost like a Gnostic idea of like the soul. It's like your true self is this. And it's kind of completely detached from your body, as if you're not your body. And so we've entered into this kind of weird paradigm in which the choosing of the self has become this kind of liberal apex, and that we must all kind of go on this bizarre journey to discover our individuality, which is completely compatible with consumer capitalism and the liberal individualism at its worst.
Yes.
So I think, along with a lot of women in particular, but not only, I think that I wanted to be strategic as well in my use of saying, like, being very clear and saying, like, sex is real. Men exist, women exist. It's important to recognize these things and not drift off into some kind of fantasy that we can all choose our sex. That doesn't mean that people can't express themselves wherever they want, but it's just not to go so far into this fantasy, where I think people are encouraged to live in a way that is actually very detrimental to themselves, but rather accept a certain level of basic reality, which has social and political consequences for all of us.
I think actually what's interesting about that, you allude to it there, is that the whole idea, oh well, you don't have to, the girl doesn't have to like pink, the boy doesn't have to automatically like blue growing up. That sort of almost seems quaint now, because what's happening now, particularly with the trans lobby, is that they're looking at a boy who only likes pink and maybe dolls, and they're saying, well, he's obviously a girl then. This is, we've sort of gone back. It's like, what are you talking about? I mean, the old liberal position was, hey, what's wrong with a boy liking that? Now it's, well, looking at him and saying, well, actually, to all intents and purposes, you're obviously a girl, so let's start giving you, puberty blockers or whatever it is.
No, it's insane. I mean, it's child abuse, and it's completely regressive. It also punishes children who may be gay, who are gender non-conforming. A lot of people have been pointing this out. LGB Alliance, defending same-sex on the basis of, sex as sexual attraction. I think, making children make decisions about their fertility when they don't even maybe know what that means will be looked back upon with kind of horror. We already see a lot of people transitioning. I think there'll be a lot of legal cases about this. And of course, like many people, especially women, have been severely punished for saying anything about this, whether it's to do with the importance of sex in law or women's sports, which is also kind of being destroyed by narcissists. And I think, one of the problems we've got is a culture that actually rewards forms of parental narcissism and even like Munchausen's by proxy. You can get a lot of attention if you say that your kid is trans, and there's a kind of social contagion aspect to it. But I think this is, ultimately there are lots of terrible aspects to this and lots of horrifying aspects. And I think the idea that children can be trans and if a child says, I prefer doing this thing than another, then therefore they must be the opposite sex, is one of the most regressive ideas that has emerged in the past sort of few years.
One of the ideas that has emerged is this whole phenomena of supposed toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it's interesting, because quite recently I was at dinner and there were other people at the table, and in fact Ollie, our cameraman, was with me, so he can attest to this. basically, we were sitting at a table, and there was a young woman, and she was explaining to her friends there why everything had gone wrong with her relationship, and she kept referring to toxic masculinity. What I found odd about that was that she put it down to some objective thing as well. I mean, I don't know what was wrong with the relationship. Obviously, I don't know them, but it was very interesting that she used that phrase. Do you think we should just stop using this phrase?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, for sure. I mean, I think there's, one of the things I try and talk about in the book is like, often when relationships break down, it's not particularly anyone's fault. And a lot of the time people are looking to be the victim when actually it might just have been a bad relationship. But I think it's very morally important that we say that everyone is capable of harm, right? Everyone is capable, men and women, of both causing harm and also being harmed, right? Because if the moment you start saying, well, women are always the victims, then you kind of deny them moral agency. And we're back to, some very, very hierarchical model, right? Which I totally want to avoid. Like, I think life is risk. Someone like Camille Paglia is amazing on this stuff. And I think I agree with her on this question of risk and reality. So I think it's just a very easy way of saying of kind of releasing oneself from any culpability. If you can talk, appeal to this supposed ontological thing, it doesn't mean that men can't behave badly, but so can women. Do you think there is such a thing as toxic femininity? Yes, I do. I mean, I think if we're going to say there's toxic masculinity, then if we are, yes. I mean, it might be things like the kind of the HR woman, or the kind of the feminization of particular institutions, which I think has been severely detrimental for again a sort of acceptance of risk and the grey area and playfulness and the fact that people make mistakes. I think there are tendencies in both sexes that we might want to, discuss, but in a more light-hearted way. Yes. Do you know what I mean? Like there's always a kind of game and a playfulness, like between the sexes, and it's not always to do with sex, it's to do with discourse and how we get along, But I think, it's always this kind of question of balance. And I think in some ways, some things have been overly feminized, right? What would those things be? I mean, I think I know, like you're talking about risk-averse thing, right? If one's going to talk about classic things, it would be maybe a very strong sense of safety, for example. Would that be a feminine thing, do you think, or not? Yeah, potentially. I mean, I think in some senses it makes sense. If you want to protect your children and so on, it makes sense to be able to understand which men might be predators, right? But this is actually something that's also being eroded by our kind of liberal culture, which is to do with female intuition and who isn't and isn't trustworthy. And if you're being told, no, you're not allowed to say that, about particular men, then you're also eliminating that. So I think, but I don't know, I think like primary schools, for example, is a classic example of where women dominate and often this seems to mitigate against young boys in a way being allowed to behave in the way that they do without being punished, if you see what I mean, or without being put on drugs for their supposed bad behaviour. I mean, I increasingly think that probably schools should go back to being segregated for everyone's sake. Right, okay. Yeah. Mine was. I mean, was yours? No, I went to a comprehensive school. Well, mine was just an old-fashioned grammar school. Yeah. But it was sort of segregated. I think what's interesting, there's another point that came up when I was reading the book, is that we're going to talk a bit about your politics, but broadly you might say it would be considered not a left-wing, well, yes, partly a left-wing perspective, which is that a lot of this has come down to the dominance of hyper-individual capitalism, that basically we're all just consumers and it doesn't really matter. So you talk about these various institutions, such as family, honour, religion, those sort of things, has been washed away by consumer capitalism. And this is what has brought about, in some ways, this problem for men. Is that right? Yeah, partly. I mean, I think I'm very influenced by people like Ivan Illich, who's a kind of renegade Catholic thinker who wrote some very brilliant books that were critical of institutions, but also kind of defended ideas of conviviality and of a kind of social life and a spiritual life outside of the institution and outside of this kind of, increasing individualism and so on. So Yeah, I like these kind of renegade thinkers who are hard to pin down politically as well. Like it's difficult to say whether Illich is left, centre or right in lots of ways. There are elements of all of those thinking in his own. So I think, I don't know. I mean, there is a kind of complexity in talking about capitalism. I mean, I suppose I mean a particular kind of capitalism, which emphasises the kind of consumer individualism. You know, I don't have. I mean, maybe we could talk about markets against capital or something. I'm not against markets as such. I think they're a kind of deep anthropological feature of our history.
You see, the reason I asked you this, Nina, is I think it's a fascinating point, actually. I can absolutely see the logic of your argument, but coming from my political perspective, it seems to me that they might have worked in an unholy alliance, but that the destruction of those things I mentioned has come almost entirely from the left. You know, that sort of the destruction of a sense of communal patriotism, family, all the kind of attacks have basically become effectively, to begin with, ideological in many ways, and indeed feminism. That in fact they've come from the left, and where they've been given this strength is by the extraordinary economic dynamics of our time. So, would you accept that or not really?
And there may be a point of disagreement here, but it's because when I think of conservatism, I think of preservation, I think of slowness, but I don't think that's what actual conservatives did, if you see what I mean. Yeah. I think in fact they were in hock to the free market and destruction and the destructive element of that, rather than saying, you know, why don't we protect our sovereignty and produce all our own food and become, you know, be self-sufficient and respect our own heritage and all of those sorts of things. So I think free market ideology in practice is not conservatism, as I understand it.
No, but this is a point. This is a big point. You would know. I mean, it's one of the big arguments on the right, if you would like. I mean, when I look at people who are absolute free market purists, they are a million miles from me, for example.
Right.
Not because I don't believe in capitalism, because I do, but I see a lot of them. They don't really care, for example, much about patriotism. Not really. They don't care about immigration, for example, very much. You know, it's all a matter of the market is dominant. So that has this effect, does it not, on traditional kind of ideas of how we see men and women?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's coming from both the left and the right, if you see what I mean. I'm increasingly interested in what it means to talk about place. I'm very much interested in questions of heritage. I think the left have made mistakes in terms of giving up any discussion of belonging and the land. You know, they've ceded all of that discussion to the right and to this kind of often a very flimsy idea of what they think patriotism or nationalism is. I mean, well, it suits them to be patriotic for countries like Ukraine at the moment. But, you know, I think there has been a kind of an absence of a real discussion about what it means to belong, to feel proud, to you know, in the sense of, I mean, I grew up in Wiltshire, which is a beautiful place that has enormous amounts of prehistory, you know, and they're extraordinary places. And I think the idea that anyone who's kind of interested in history or heritage must therefore be reactionary or right-wing is just like completely misplaced. And yeah, so I don't know, but I do think there's a particular kind of consumer capitalism which is extremely destructive on these relations. And whether we see that as left or right or just something else, maybe slightly inhuman. You know.
I mean, like, for example, some of our viewers, for example, might get in touch or have done in the past to express their anger at the way that men are portrayed, say, in ads.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, but that is a commercial consideration, just as much as it's anything. You know, they're saying men are always seen as stupid.
Yeah, it's true.
You know, especially white men. You know what's going on. But the thing is, no one is going to do this if it doesn't get the money on profit, surely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I totally agree with that diagnosis, though. I mean, I think it's absolutely ill-dignified, the way that, you know, men are portrayed in mainstream culture. You know, it's as if, men are like always foolish or idiotic, or, you know, there's no respect for fathers in particular. And I think there's also no respect for mothers. I think mothers are also scapegoated horribly as well, like actual mothers, if you see what I mean, the figure of the mother. So I think we need to resurrect a respect for our elders, right? That whether they're our actual parents or our ancestors or all of those things. I mean, again, it makes no sense to to pretend that we're somehow cut off from all of these ties, or as if our ancestors didn't have wisdom. And I make that point in the book. And so sure, I mean, it maybe it's profitable to portray men in this way, but it's still wrong, you know. I mean, it's a moral question, I suppose it's just I think, well, the things that people really care about, right, I don't think are money. They are social relations. They are the people that you love, your friends. They are things that you value, like nature, outside of those economic bonds. And to see everything in an economic way is just, I don't know, so it's kind of horrific, actually.
Well, it is kind of horrific, but also, over the past few years, we see just example after example after example. Brexit, I feel, would be one of the perfect one. Still, to this day, many Remainers, the Remainer argument, still cannot quite understand all the non-economic arguments people might have, because you can't often prove them, can you? In the sense that, there's something in the air, a sense of community and locality and all of this. It's very important. I've sort of like assumed your left-wingery, but I think what would you call yourself if you have to call yourself anything, Nanine? I mean, and did you start off as something else? A lot of people who've come through this studio have been on journeys, in some ways. It's that terrible cliche, Simon, Piers Morgan journeys or whatever. But have you had one?
Yeah, I guess so. Although I do think that most of my intuitions, at least, are the same as they were when I was about 15. But I think the various Overton windows have shifted in such bizarre ways since then. Yeah. So, I'm very much interested in community, sociability, humour, free expression, in defence of arts and culture. All of these things that I think make life worth living. And I think the left used to be much, much better on freedom of expression, or at least the left that I remember. So I don't know. It's very hard for me to say where I am now, in some ways, like old left. But I mean, probably now but then for some people I would be kind of far right or a Nazi even, and some idiots.
Mind you, that takes in probably 90% of the world now.
No, exactly.
If you listen to these people.
No, exactly. So I mean, I don't, so that's not true either, obviously. And it's just a word that people toss around to everyone they don't like. So I don't know. I mean, I tried in a way to be kind of more or less not very political in that book. I tried to kind of almost be centrist in the kind of approach, which is to say, to listen to both sides and to look at what's really going on with men and how this relates to how we might rethink our relations. I mean, I'm very interested in talking to anybody and everybody, right? I think one of the things that the left increasingly did was to say, no, we can't listen to this person. We've got to no platform that person, and this happened to a lot of women who wanted to talk about, proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act. And, I myself got kind of cancelled and mobbed and people emailing everyone.
Tell us what happened there. What?
Oh, I mean, it was very silly. I posted something on Facebook about how, because I used to be a member of the Labour Party and I'm not anymore, obviously, but I'm not a very active member. But, I was very involved in the student protests and defending people who'd been prosecuted from them. And I was very committed to the idea of free education. And I posted something about what was going on in the Labour Party, where various women were being kind of interrogated, literally, about their things they'd said in relation to the proposed change to the Gender Recognition Act. And I thought these women are being treated appallingly, these secret kind of, really, they were interrogations, and they'd leaked some of the transcripts. And I read them and I just thought, I don't want to live in this world, where women are being hauled over the coals for asking perfectly reasonable questions about policy, And so I thought, I could see this issue maybe becoming something that, really sadistic people were using to attack others. And there was a lot of this going on, and so I suppose I posted something thinking, this will probably get some, negative reaction. But I didn't realise what would actually happen, which is you actually get targeted by specific activists, and, and then people kind of denounce you, and they write to everyone you've ever worked with, or they try to get your work removed, or they try to get your book cancelled, or they try to stop you from speaking. I gave talks about the Masculinity project, at university, and the university was so scared that I would be attacked that they hired security guards to protect me.
Yeah.
You know, and this isn't uncommon. You know, people like Selena Todd and Kathleen Stock, and you know, all these women who said a lot more than I did. You know, we're really brave. Or look at the way J.K. Rowling has been treated. You know, and it's kind of insane, right? It's just so. That was like a real experience of the reality of, I don't know, some of today's horrors.
Do you in the book, you know, you put forward some ideas of what should happen. I don't mean to wrongly summarize it, but it seems to me that we've just got to come together and basically talk more. But how do you think, how can that be done? I mean, particularly now that we're becoming more and more atomized, more and more isolated, you know, dating, such like this, you know, you hear horror stories about it now. I mean, how the hell can we do that?
Well, I think in the first place it's about recognising these forms of division and how these technologies and like the last 2 years of COVID are basically like, you know, technologies to kind of separate us and to make us feel that we've got less in common. And I think this rhetoric that, you know, against men and dividing men and women has been going on for a long time. So I think in the first place, it's about recognising those forces that seek to divide people and to prevent dialogue and to prevent, you know, people who disagree from talking to each other. You know, I'm a philosopher. I believe in dialogue, you know, and reason and these sorts of things. And again, I suppose it's like that. I talk about this idea of eutropelia, which I take from Illich, who takes it from the Greeks, which is this idea of graceful play. That actually one of the ways of interacting that's most beautiful is to engage in a form of like beautiful play, which is to do with how we speak to each other and, you know, that we have time and we listen to each other and we talk. So I think in the first place, it's maybe about a generosity. Like if somebody's, you know, like if men are saying, look, we're upset about this thing, or, you know, access to children, or, you know, the suicide rate, or these very serious things, it's like saying, rather than just this sneering, dismissive attitude. It's like saying, well, how can we actually listen to people, see what's going on, you know, then come to some negotiation or this discussion so that we can make as many people happy as possible. I'm not utilitarian, but, you know, to actually take seriously the fact that everybody suffers. You know, I think one of the dominant implicit ideas of recent years has been this idea that only some people suffer. You know, and that like if a white man says he's suffering, it's not really, you know, which is just horrific. I mean, it's just like inhuman. You know, it's like everybody suffers by virtue of being alive. You know, being alive is difficult.
But we do live, don't we, in remarkably ungenerous times.
Yeah.
I mean, harsh, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's like identifying who benefits from that or why this rhetoric is increasingly dividing people. You know, like that's what I mean about the old left. I think the old left was not divisive in this way. It was like even if people disagree or if they have an idea about immigration or something, it's like you talk to everybody, you listen to people, you know, you hear their concerns and you try to understand them. You don't, you know, like a steamroller in and say this is the right line and anyone who disagrees must be a Nazi. You know, I mean, the left have lost the working class. Like they don't, you know, over Brexit, over, I don't know, the Canadian truckers, you know, every time the working class actually does something which is quite left-wing, actually, or historically would have been perceived that way, they're just ignored it or actually demeaned.
Oh, I'd say more than
I mean,
demonized. You know, utterly demonized. I know your book isn't, you know, your book is a serious discussion. It's not a self-help book or anything. But you know, one thing that does come a lot in one's own life, you know, talking to friends and that is that younger guys now feel really inhibited about, you know, dates and things, very, very concerned and worried about dating because they just think, you know, they're going to, if they put a foot wrong, you know. Do you think that they exaggerate that, or do you think they've got a point?
I think they have a point. I mean, I think if you know, most people, for example, used to meet or a lot of people met their spouse at work. Now, if you flirted with someone at work, you wouldn't because you'd be worried about being hauled up on a sexual harassment charge. You know, so that's about the HR thing and this kind of, you know, creating this suspicious world in which everyone's motive is somehow like evil or, you know, negative, and particularly men, right? So I think, if you're a young man today, it would be very terrifying. And I talk about this paradox of like the puritanical, like the idea we both live in like this really hedonistic culture that encourages people to get drunk and take drugs and have sex. But on the other hand, if you make a mistake and it's not even clear what the rules are, you are like absolutely punished and condemned. You know, so obviously I think the implicit effect of that is one of fear and suspicion, because nobody wants to be the person who's, you know, done something wrong, who, you know, who might be accused of abuse or sexual harassment. You know, on the other hand, everybody's make mistakes. You know, everybody is like kissed the wrong person or been a dick or gotten drunk. You know what I mean? It's and I think there used to be more, I don't know, acceptance of that grey area, the fact that social life is really difficult sometimes, that, you know, like sometimes people have an argument and then you've got to apologise later, and, you know, everyone is capable of being an idiot. And so I wanted there's that sort of generosity to come back. But I do think more practically, I mean, I joked about this earlier, but, you know, the technology, these dating apps, they mitigate against risk in real life, like the random encounter. You know, let's say with someone you completely disagree with, you know, the apps screen for disagreement over difficult issues. You know, and I think that isn't why you love somebody, it isn't why you like them, or it isn't why you fancy them either. And so I think what is important is these other alternatives that are real life, like going to church or being involved in, I don't know, like education, evening classes, or like places where you meet people. Volunteering, like, you know, where you might get to know somebody in real life, you know, rather than the enforced date, which I think makes people extremely jaded. You know, people start to think of each other as things, you know, as commodities, or more or less exchangeable, and people are not fungible. You know, everybody is like unique, you know, in an individual, and the reason why we love people is for that uniqueness. You know, not because they fulfill a need or they are exchangeable with someone else.
I think, you know, that point about doing something outside of yourself, you know, I think is so important. I'd say almost for all relationships, not just between men and women. You know, some of the best friendships I've made have been where there is a common purpose outside, to use that expression, outside of both of us, maybe political or maybe charitable, something like that. It just seems to bring people together, I think, far more. And, you know, this is like got the air of auditions about it, hasn't it? The whole dating thing.
No, for sure. And it's like, you know, people get too obsessed with themselves, and that's actually really bad. It's boring, you know, and destructive, and it makes people depressed.
Well, if you don't want to be depressed, you should read the book. What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents by Nina Power. It's in bookshops, presumably, and on Amazon, right?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Nina, thanks so much for coming in and talking all about it. It's lovely. And all the very best.
Thanks.
And I know that this will, I'm sure, have quite a market, so it'll do well. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for So What You're Saying Is this week. For our members, we have some exclusive content, so I'm going to be asking Nina a few more questions, but to everybody else, we shall see you next time on So What You're Saying Is. Thank you. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.